The wind howled through the Montana mountains like a wounded beast, rattling the thick log walls of the cabin that had been Jedediah Holt's only companion for 15 winters. He sat by the stone fireplace, carving another wooden figure with hands that knew no other purpose than work. The flames cast dancing shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the deep lines etched by grief and solitude. At 39, Jed looked older. His dark hair, streaked with premature gray, hung to his shoulders, and his beard had grown wild and untamed. He'd stopped caring about appearances the day he buried Mary and their unborn child in the Kansas prairie. That was another lifetime. Another man, one who believed in God's mercy and the promise of tomorrow. The cabin measured no more than 20 feet square, built with his own hands from pine logs dragged down the mountainside. Every notch, every chink filled with mud and moss, spoke of desperate determination to create a fortress against memory. A ladder led to the sleeping loft where a simple straw mattress lay beneath heavy fur blankets. Below, the main room held only necessities: a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, though only one was ever used, shelves lined with preserved meat and dried herbs, and his rifles mounted on pegs above the door. Through the single window, glazed with real glass he'd hauled from Billings at considerable expense, Jed watched the December snow fall thick and relentless. The year was 1879, though he rarely bothered with calendars anymore. Time meant nothing when each day bled into the next with the same hollow rhythm. Wake, work, eat, sleep, and try not to dream. His horse, Thunder, shifted restlessly in the lean-to stable built against the cabin's west wall. The big black stallion was the only living creature Jed trusted, the only one who never asked for more than hay and shelter. Thunder understood silence, respected boundaries, and never demanded explanations for the nightmares that sometimes drove Jed from his bed to pace the cabin floor until dawn. Jed set down his carving, another wolf, always wolves, and stirred the pot of venison stew bubbling over the fire. The meat came from a buck he'd shot 3 days prior, field-dressed and butchered, with the efficiency of long practice. Living this high in the mountains meant self-sufficiency or death. No general stores, no neighbors, no helping hands, just the way he wanted it. The nearest town, Cedar Ridge, lay 2 days, ride through treacherous passes that claimed at least one traveler every winter. Jed made the journey only twice a year for supplies: ammunition, salt, coffee, tobacco, and whiskey. The townspeople had learned not to engage him in conversation beyond the necessary transactions. They called him the hermit of Wolverine Peak and crossed themselves when his tall, lean figure appeared on Main Street. He didn't care what they called him. Words were for people who still believed in human connection, who hadn't learned the fundamental truth Jed carried like a stone in his chest. Caring for someone meant watching them die. Love was just another word for inevitable loss. Mary's face haunted him still, though 15 years had blurred the details. Sometimes he forgot the exact shade of her corn silk hair, or the way her laugh sounded on Sunday mornings. But he remembered with perfect clarity the moment life drained from her eyes, taking their child with her. The frontier doctor, drunk and useless, had arrived too late. The preacher spoke of God's plan, while Jed dug 2 graves in the frozen ground. That night he burned their little homestead to ash and rode west until the mountains swallowed him whole. Here, in this wilderness fortress, he'd built a life stripped of anything that might betray him again. No photographs, no mementos, no reminders of the man who'd once believed in happiness. The wooden wolves accumulated on the mantel, a pack of silent guardians carved during countless lonely evenings. Wolves understood. They mated for life but hunted alone when necessary. They survived by tooth and claw, by instinct and weariness. They trusted nothing beyond their own strength. Outside, the storm intensified. December in Montana meant temperatures that could freeze a man's blood in his veins, snow that piled higher than a horse's back, and winds that scoured exposed flesh like sandpaper. But the cabin held firm, its thick walls and tight construction a testament to Jed's skill. The fireplace drew properly, sending smoke up the stone chimney while radiating warmth throughout the small space. He'd chosen this location carefully, a natural clearing on a south-facing slope, protected from the worst winds by a granite cliff face, with a spring that rarely froze completely. Game trails crisscrossed the valleys below, ensuring meat when his aim held true. Timber stood thick on all sides, providing endless fuel and building material. A man could live here forever without seeing another human soul. That was the plan. Live alone, die alone, hurt no one, and be hurt by no one. The mountains asked nothing of him except strength and caution. They didn't lie or pretend or promise things they couldn't deliver. When avalanches thundered down distant slopes or grizzlies prowled too close to the cabin, at least the danger was honest, visible, manageable. Jed pulled on his heavy buffalo coat and stepped outside to check on Thunder. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving snow into his face with stinging force. This storm felt different somehow, angrier than usual. The old-timers in Cedar Ridge would call it a widowmaker, the kind that buried unwary travelers and collapsed poorly built roofs. Thunder nickered softly as Jed entered the stable. The warmth of the horse's body was a welcome contrast to the Arctic air. He forked fresh hay into the manger and broke the ice on the water bucket. His hands moved automatically through the familiar routine, while his mind wandered to practical concerns. Did he have enough firewood split? Were the meat stores adequate if the storm lasted a week? Had he checked the rifle's action recently? These thoughts kept the other ones at bay, the dangerous ones that sometimes crept in during the long winter nights. Thoughts of what might have been, of children who would never be born, of a woman's touch he'd never feel again. Such thinking led nowhere good. Down paths that ended in whiskey bottles and loaded guns pointed at nothing worth shooting. Better to focus on survival, on the simple, brutal arithmetic of frontier life. Calories burned versus calories consumed. Ammunition spent versus game taken. Days of wood split versus days of cold ahead. These equations had answers. Solutions that didn't require faith or hope or any of the other lies men told themselves. As Jed secured the stable door against the wind, he paused, listening. Something in the storm's voice had changed, a note of urgency that raised the hair on his neck. He'd lived in these mountains long enough to read their moods like scripture. This blizzard carried menace in its howl, the promise of tragedy for anyone caught exposed on the ridges tonight. He thought briefly of the stage road that wound through the valley below, the weekly coach from Billings to Cedar Ridge. But surely no driver would attempt that road in this weather. Even greenhorns, fresh from the east, knew better than to challenge a Montana winter storm. Still, the unease lingered as he returned to the cabin. Jed barred the door and added another log to the fire, settling back into his chair with his carving knife and the unfinished wolf. The blade moved in smooth, practiced strokes, revealing the creature hidden in the wood. This one would be howling, head thrown back in eternal cry to an empty sky. Like him, the wooden wolf would never receive an answer. That was the nature of things in the mountains. You howled at the moon, but the moon never howled back. You loved with all your heart, but hearts stopped beating. You built your life on solid ground, but the ground shifted and swallowed everything whole. The wind screamed louder, shaking the cabin with renewed fury. Somewhere out in that maelstrom, Jed suspected someone was learning these lessons the hard way. But that wasn't his concern. He'd paid his tuition in blood and tears 15 years ago. Now he just carved his wolves and waited for the storm to pass, as all storms eventually did. The storm raged through the night with fury, as if all the demons of winter had gathered on Wolverine Peak. Jed dozed fitfully in his chair, jerking awake each time the wind struck the cabin with fresh force. By dawn, the howling had faded to a low moan, leaving behind a world buried in white. He pushed open the cabin door against a 3-foot drift, squinting in the bright morning light. The snow had transformed everything into a silent world of white waves and frozen stillness. Even sound seemed trapped beneath it. Thunder's anxious whinny broke the quiet. Jed followed it to the stable, where the stallion pawed nervously at the ground, ears turned toward the valley. "What's the matter, boy?" Jed murmured, rubbing the horse's neck. Thunder's unease rarely came without reason. The stallion could sense danger long before human eyes saw it. Jed saddled up despite the knee-deep snow, strapping on his snowshoes and taking his rifle from its pegs. They moved slowly down the mountain trail, Thunder pushing through drifts that would have stopped a lesser animal. The stage road lay somewhere below, invisible beneath the snow. But Jed knew these mountains better than most men knew their own families. Every tree, every bend, every boulder was imprinted in his memory. An hour into the descent, Thunder halted suddenly. His nostrils flared, breath steaming in the cold air. Jed dismounted, rifle in hand, and moved forward through a stand of pines. What he saw stopped him cold. The stagecoach lay on its side like a broken toy, one wheel still spinning lazily in the wind. Snow had half buried it, its bright paint dulled by ice. The horses, 4 of them, were frozen solid in their traces. The driver hung from his seat at an angle no living man could manage. Jed approached carefully, eyes scanning for movement. Nothing. The strong box had burst open, its contents scattered. Letters, parcels, even a child's carved horse half buried in the snow. Death had come quick and cruel. He'd seen wrecks before, but something about this scene gnawed at him. The stage looked like it had been forced off the road, not simply overturned by wind. And then he heard it. A faint sound beneath the hiss of shifting snow. Not wind, not animal. A human sound. Weak, broken, but real. Jed followed it, his boots crunching through the crusted snow until he came to a drift piled against a boulder. Something dark poked through, a scrap of fabric. He knelt, brushing the snow aside. The fabric was fine wool lined with fur. Not the kind worn by settlers. Eastern, expensive. He dug faster, bare hands scraping ice. A gloved hand appeared, small, delicate, then an arm, a shoulder, a face. A woman lay curled like a child, her chestnut hair frozen in tangled strands against her cheek. Her traveling dress was torn and soaked, her skin pale as marble. Jed pressed 2 fingers to her neck, expecting nothing. For a long second, there was only stillness. Then, there. A pulse, faint, fragile, but alive. He cursed under his breath. This was trouble. Nothing good ever came of rescuing strangers. He should leave her. Should climb back on Thunder and ride home before the storm buried them both. But he couldn't. His arms were already lifting her, gathering her against his chest. She weighed next to nothing, all soaked fabric and freezing flesh. Her head lolled against his shoulder, lips blue, breath shallow. Thunder stamped nervously as Jed struggled into the saddle, cradling her across his front. "Easy, boy," he said. "We're going home." The climb back up the mountain was a battle. Snow drifted to the horse's flanks, and Jed's muscles burned from holding her tight. Each minute felt longer than the last. Her breathing grew fainter, and he urged Thunder faster, cursing every rock and fallen branch in their path. By the time the cabin came into view, his arms were numb from cold and strain. He kicked the door open, carried her inside, and dropped the bar behind him. The fire had nearly gone out. He threw wood on it until flames roared again, then laid her on the rug before the hearth. Her clothes were soaked through. She'd die if he didn't act fast. Jed hesitated for only a moment before unbuttoning the blue dress. Beneath it, layers of corset, chemise, and petticoats. Too many for a mountain winter. His hands shook, not from desire, but from nerves and urgency. He hadn't undressed a woman since Mary. He stripped away the wet layers until she lay in, only her thin shift, the fabric clinging to her like a second skin. Even then, modesty made him turn his head away as he worked. He grabbed his thick buffalo robe and wrapped her in it, tucking it close around her shoulders. Her skin felt like ice beneath his rough hands. He rubbed her arms and hands gently, trying to coax warmth back. "Come on," he muttered. "Don't you die on me now." The fire crackled louder, heat filling the small cabin. Steam rose from the clothes hanging by the hearth, filling the air with the scent of wet wool and faint perfume, lavender and rose, an impossible softness in his rough world. For the first time in years, his home smelled of something human. He sat back, exhausted, and watched the rise and fall of her chest beneath the robe. Each shallow breath felt like a small victory. But her eyes remained closed, her face still pale and still. Jed ran a hand through his hair, staring into the flames. What had he done? He'd spent 15 years keeping the world out, and in one storm he'd brought it straight through his door. If she lived, she'd bring questions, expectations, conversation, company, disruption. And if she died? He looked at her again, and something inside him stirred, a flicker of something long buried beneath years of solitude. He turned away sharply, grabbing his carving knife just to have something to hold. "You're on your own, lady," he muttered, though he knew it wasn't true. Because for the first time in 15 years, Jed Holt wasn't alone anymore. The storm outside roared again, and deep down he knew this wasn't just another blizzard. This was the storm that would change everything. Hours passed as the fire burned low, shadows stretching long across the cabin floor. Jed sat motionless in his chair, listening to the sound of her breathing. Slow, uneven, but there. The storm outside had calmed, leaving behind only the occasional groan of snow sliding off the roof. He leaned forward and checked her pulse again. Still faint but stronger than before. He wasn't sure whether to feel relief or dread. If she lived, she'd change everything. If she died, he wasn't sure what that would make him anymore. The woman stirred near sunset. A faint sound escaped her lips, a soft moan of pain or confusion. Jed froze. Then her eyes fluttered open. They were green, the clear, deep kind that made him forget how to breathe for a moment. She blinked, unfocused, taking in the cabin, the fire, and then him. Her confusion shifted to alarm. In an instant, she was sitting up, clutching the buffalo robe to her throat. "Where am I?" she gasped, voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. "Safe," Jed said quietly, raising his hands. "You were in a wreck. Stagecoach. Crashed in the storm. You'd have frozen if I hadn't found you." Her eyes darted to her clothes hanging by the fire. Petticoats, corset, dress, all drying in the heat. The color drained from her face. "You undressed me." Jed straightened, his voice calm but rough. "You were soaked through. Wet clothes kill faster than cold." "I did what I had to." Her fingers gripped the robe tighter. "And what else did you do?" "Nothing that'll shame you," he said, his tone like stone. "You were half dead. I just kept you alive." She studied him for a long moment, breathing hard, weighing whether to believe him. Finally, her shoulders dropped slightly. "Everyone else on the coach, are they?" "All gone," he said softly. "You're the only one left." Her hand covered her mouth, and the truth hit her, Mr. Hartley. "Mrs. Peyton, little James." Her voice broke. Jed looked away, giving her the small mercy of privacy as she began to sob. Real, raw grief that filled the cabin with sound he hadn't heard in years. When she quieted, her face was blotched with tears and ash smudged from the hearth. She drew a shuddering breath. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "You don't have to apologize for living," Jed said. She looked at him again, really seeing him for the first time. The broad shoulders, the gray-streaked hair, the hard lines carved by years of solitude. "Who are you?" "Jed Holt." "I'm Charlotte. Charlotte Whitmore of Boston." She tried to sit straighter, her city manners creeping through the exhaustion. "Thank you, Mr. Holt, for saving my life." Jed nodded once. "You needed saving." The wind outside howled again, a reminder that the world beyond those log walls was still frozen and cruel. Charlotte flinched, pulling the robe closer. "How long until we can get to town?" He glanced toward the window. "Could be days. Could be a week. Depends on the weather." Her composure cracked again. "A week. Surely there's a way." "This is Montana," he said simply. "Storms here don't care what you think's possible." She fell silent, absorbing the truth of it. The fire popped. Somewhere in the distance, a tree split under the weight of snow. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Then we're stuck here," she murmured, afraid, so Charlotte pressed her lips together, fighting to regain her poise. "Then I suppose we'll have to make the best of it, Mr. Holt." Jed gave a slow nod, his jaw tight. He'd saved her life, yes, but now she was here. A living, breathing reminder of everything he'd buried. And for the first time in 15 years, the cabin didn't feel like a refuge. It felt like a test. That night, Charlotte sat by the fire, her green eyes following every movement he made. The silence between them stretched thin, filled with the soft crackle of burning wood and the faint sigh of wind through the cracks. "I need my clothes," she said suddenly. "Surely they're dry by now." "Not yet," Jed replied without turning. "Tomorrow. This is intolerable." She lifted her chin. "You must have something. Shirt, trousers, anything." He hesitated, then sighed. From the old trunk beneath his bed, he pulled out a flannel shirt and wool trousers. "They'll be too big. I'll manage." He handed them over and stepped outside without another word, giving her privacy. The cold bit through his coat, sharp and merciless, but it felt easier to face than the warmth he'd left behind. When he returned, she was dressed in his clothes. They hung loose on her frame, but she stood tall, some dignity restored. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer now. He nodded. "Get some rest. Loft's up there." "And where will you sleep?" Quote. "Down here." "Fire needs tending," she hesitated, eyes flicking to his bed, then back to the flames. "It hardly seems fair." "Life's not fair," he said flatly. "Go on." Charlotte climbed the ladder slowly, pausing at the top. "Good night, Mr. Holt." Jed stared into the fire. "Good night, Miss Whitmore." The cabin fell silent again, but as the flames danced, he could hear the faint creak of the straw mattress above him, the sound of another soul breathing under his roof. It should have bothered him. But for reasons he couldn't explain, it didn't. For the first time in 15 years, Jed Holt didn't mind the sound of another heartbeat in the dark. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of winter dawn that barely bothered to rise. Jed had already been up for hours, splitting wood in the yard, trying to burn off the restless energy twisting inside him. Every swing of the axe echoed through the trees. Every blow was a reminder that he wasn't alone anymore. When he finally stepped back into the cabin, Charlotte was awake. She had braided her chestnut hair into a single neat plait and was crouched near the fire, stirring the pot with careful hands. The smell of coffee filled the air, strong, bitter, and familiar. "I found your tin," she said quickly when he hesitated in the doorway. "I hope you don't mind." It seemed foolish to let the fire die. Jed hung up his coat and nodded. "You did right." Her relief was small but visible. "I wanted to be useful," she added quietly. He poured himself a cup and sat down at the table. "You don't have to be—" "I do," she said, her voice steady. "I can't sit here and feel helpless. Tell me what needs doing." Jed studied her face. There was color in her cheeks now, strength creeping back into her posture. "You can help split kindling," he said finally. "But you'll need gloves." "I'll manage," she replied, lifting her chin. Later that morning, he watched as she tried to copy his rhythm with the hatchet. Her first few swings were wild, barely denting the wood, but she refused to give up. By the fifth strike, the log split clean in two. She looked up, grinning, despite herself. "I did it?" "Don't celebrate too much," Jed said, trying to keep his tone dry, though the corner of his mouth twitched. "You've got 20 more to go." She rolled her eyes, the gesture surprisingly playful. "You're impossible." Been told that before by afternoon they had fallen into a rhythm. Charlotte gathered wood and kept the fire strong. Jed checked the traps and brought in more meat. When he returned, she was waiting at the door with a towel and a faint smile. "You were gone longer than I expected," she said. "I was starting to think you'd frozen out there. Didn't know you cared." Her gaze met his. You saved my life. I care whether you come back or not." That simple truth hit him harder than any storm. He turned away before she could see the flicker of emotion cross his face. That night they sat together by the fire, eating stew in companionable silence. Charlotte traced her finger along the edge of one of his carvings, a wolf with its head raised to the sky. "You made this." He nodded. "Passes the time. It's beautiful, so alive. You could sell these. Don't need money," he muttered. "Maybe not," she said softly, "but you need purpose. This looks like more than passing time." He didn't answer, but something about her words stayed with him. Purpose. It was a word he hadn't thought about in years. After dinner, Charlotte cleaned the dishes while he whittled. The small cabin was filled with the soft sounds of domestic life, the scrape of metal, the crackle of the fire, the low hum of wind outside. It felt natural, dangerous but natural. As she finished, she turned to him with a hesitant smile. "Would you show me how to carve?" He raised an eyebrow. "Not exactly a lady's pastime. Neither is splitting wood. But I managed that." He studied her for a moment, then handed over a small piece of pine and one of his spare knives. "Start with this. It's softer." Her first attempt was clumsy, but she laughed at her mistakes, a sound so warm it seemed to thaw something inside him. "Careful," he warned as she nicked her thumb. He reached out on instinct, taking her hand. The cut was shallow, but the sight of her blood against his rough fingers made his chest tighten. "Not deep," he said, wrapping it gently in a scrap of cloth. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither moved. The firelight flickered between them, casting shadows that felt too intimate, too real. "Thank you," she whispered. Jed released her hand as if burned. "You should rest," she nodded, though her cheeks were flushed. She climbed the ladder to the loft, pausing halfway up. "You said something earlier about storms teaching hard lessons. Is that true for people too?" He looked into the fire. Every storm leaves a mark. Some heal, some don't. Quote, Charlotte nodded slowly, understanding more than he'd said. "Then maybe this one will heal something, for both of us." When she disappeared into the loft, Jed stared at the glowing embers until his vision blurred. She was changing things, bit by bit, breath by breath. He could feel it. He leaned back, closing his eyes, and for the first time in 15 years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt alive. The next morning brought a weak sun, struggling through thinning clouds. For the first time in a week, the wind had quieted, and the world outside looked peaceful, a fragile kind of peace that never lasted long in Montana. Charlotte was already up when Jed opened his eyes. She moved about the cabin with practiced ease now, adding wood to the fire, setting coffee to boil, and humming softly to herself. The sound startled him. Music had no place in this cabin for 15 long years. "You're up early," he said, his voice rough from sleep. "I couldn't stay still." She replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "The quiet feels strange after all that wind." Jed nodded, pulling on his coat. "I'm checking the traps. Might be a rabbit or two after the storm." "May I come?" she asked suddenly. He stopped, halfway to the door. "Why? I'm tired of hiding from the world. If I'm going to live here until the snow clears, I want to understand what that means." Her tone left little room for argument. Jed hesitated, then handed her an old coat. Mary's coat. He'd meant to burn it years ago but never could. Charlotte's eyes softened as she slipped it on. "Was this my wife's?" Jed said quietly. Long time ago, Charlotte didn't press. She only nodded, tightening the buttons. "Then she'd want it to keep me warm." They stepped outside into a world of blinding white. The snow glittered under the pale sun, and their breath hung in the air like smoke. Charlotte followed closely as Jed led the way down a narrow path through the pines. He showed her how to check the traps, how to look for tracks, how to move silently through the snow. She watched, listened, and learned quickly. When they found a rabbit caught in one of the snares, Jed demonstrated how to end it swiftly. Charlotte didn't flinch. "I understand," she said softly, quick and kind. He studied her, surprised by her composure. Most city women faint at the sight of blood. "I'm not most women," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. Something in that look made his heartbeat quicken. He turned away, focusing on rebaiting the trap. "We'll head back. Don't want the weather turning again." By the time they reached the cabin, the clouds were already gathering, heavy and gray. Charlotte helped him skin the rabbit, her hands steady, her expression calm. Later, as they ate by the fire, she spoke quietly. "You said this coat belonged to your wife. May I ask what happened to her?" Jed froze. The question was soft, but it struck deep. "She died," he said finally, 15 years ago. "Childbirth." Charlotte's face fell. "I'm sorry," he shook his head. "Don't be. Not your burden." But the words unlocked something he couldn't stop. She was 19. "We were just kids trying to make a life. Doctor was drunk. Came too late. I buried them myself. Then I burned the farm." Everything Charlotte set her bowl down, tears shining in her eyes. "And you came here. Wasn't anywhere else to go." The mountains don't ask questions. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire popped softly, filling the silence between them. Then Charlotte reached across the table and laid her hand over his. "You built walls to keep the pain out," she said quietly. "But walls keep everything out." Even the light Jed stared at her hand resting on his, pale, delicate, but strong. He didn't pull away this time. "You talk like you know about walls." He said, "I do," she replied. "I ran from an arranged marriage, a man who wanted my name, not my heart. I've been building my own walls ever since their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, recognition. Two broken souls who understood each other's silence." Jed cleared his throat and stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "Storm's coming again. Better bring in more wood." He stepped outside before she could answer, the cold air biting his skin. Inside, he could still feel the warmth of her touch lingering on his hand, a warmth that scared him more than any blizzard. That night, as the snow fell again, they sat by the fire. Charlotte worked carefully on one of his spare carvings, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she nicked her thumb again, he moved beside her, instinct taking over. "Let me see." He took her hand gently, cleaning the small cut. His fingers lingered a second too long. She didn't move away. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice low. "Keep it clean." "You'll be fine," he said, but his voice didn't sound like his own. She looked up, eyes catching the firelight. "You keep saving me." Jed hesitated. "Maybe I'm just saving myself." The space between them shrank until he could feel her breath against his cheek. The fire popped, and the moment broke. Jed stood abruptly. "Get some rest," he muttered, retreating to his chair. Charlotte climbed the ladder slowly, pausing halfway. "You can't hide from warmth forever, Jed Holt," she said softly. He didn't answer. But long after she'd gone to sleep, her words echoed in his head, stirring feelings he'd buried deep. For the first time since Mary's death, he wasn't sure he wanted to be alone anymore. The snow finally stopped falling 2 days later. The mountains glistened under a pale blue sky, quiet and bright after the storm's long fury. Jed stood outside the cabin, breathing the sharp air, feeling something he hadn't in years. Peace. Behind him, the door creaked open. Charlotte stepped out, wrapped in Mary's coat, her braid loose over her shoulder. Her cheeks were pink from warmth, her smile soft and unguarded. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Jed nodded. "Ain't often we get days like this." Quote. They stood side by side, watching sunlight spill across the valley. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was calm, comfortable. When they went back inside, Jed started gathering his gear. Snow's clearing, on the lower trails. "I should check the road to town, see if it's passable." Yet Charlotte's face changed, the light dimming from her eyes. "You mean, it's time for me to go?" Jed didn't answer right away. He adjusted his rifle strap, focusing on anything but her expression. "You've got people out there. Family. A new start in San Francisco, wasn't it?" "Yes," she said quietly. A new start. He met her eyes then, and something twisted inside him. The thought of this cabin without her laughter, her stubbornness, her warmth, it suddenly felt smaller, colder. "I'll be back before sundown," he said, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. She nodded, her chin trembling just slightly. "Be careful." The ride down the mountain was slow. The stage road was buried in drifts, but where the wind had swept clear, the earth gleamed hard as iron. Jed rode carefully, studying every turn. He didn't see anyone. No sign of life, no tracks, just the mountains and his own thoughts. Halfway back up the trail, Thunder's ears twitched. The stallion stopped, nostrils flaring. Jed followed his gaze. 3 dark shapes moving below, cutting through the snow. Riders. He felt it before he understood it. Trouble. He spurred Thunder forward, racing up the path. The cabin came into view just as the first gunshot cracked through the air. Charlotte screamed. Jed's heart slammed against his ribs. He slid from the saddle before the horse stopped moving, hitting the ground running. Smoke curled from the edge of the cabin roof. A warning shot. He burst through the door, rifle drawn. Charlotte was crouched by the window, pale but steady, his second rifle clutched tight in her hands. "They're coming," she said, her voice shaking. 3 of them. "One looks like—" She broke off, swallowing hard. "Jed. It's him. My fiancé." "Richard Peyton." Jed's blood went cold. "You sure?" "I'd know that face anywhere outside." Hoofbeats grew louder. Jed took a steadying breath. "Get to the loft." "Stay low." "No," she said, standing her ground. "You'll need both barrels if they try something." There was no time to argue. The riders came into view, one in an expensive coat, sitting his horse too straight for a man who'd ever done hard work. The other 2 looked mean and ready. Hired guns. Jed stepped outside, rifle in hand. The cold bit through his coat, but he didn't feel it. "You've come a long way for trouble," Mr. Richard Peyton dismounted, brushing snow from his gloves. His voice was smooth, arrogant. "Not trouble, Mr. Holt. Business. You've got something that belongs to me." "Don't see any property here," Jed said. "I think you do." Peyton's eyes flicked toward the cabin. "A woman named Charlotte Whitmore, my fiancée. She's no one's property," Jed growled. Peyton smirked. "That's where you're mistaken. Her father's debt is mine now. Our marriage settles it. I intend to collect." Jed lifted his rifle a little higher. "Then you'll be collectin' lead. Instead." Peyton's smile turned cold. "Kill him." The world exploded. Gunfire roared through the clearing. Jed dove behind the woodpile as a bullet splintered the doorframe. He fired once, hitting one gunman's shoulder. Charlotte, steady in the window, fired next. Her shot tore through the second man's hat, sending him tumbling into the snow. Peyton froze, staring in disbelief as Charlotte stepped into the doorway, rifle leveled. Her hands trembled, but her aim was true. "Charlotte," he said, his tone shifting to coaxing darling, "put the gun down. You're frightened. You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said, her voice shaking but fierce. "You tried to own me. You hurt me. You lied." "Not anymore." Jed stood beside her, rifle steady. "You heard the Lady Peyton's mask cracked. You'll regret this. Both of you." "Maybe," Jed said. "But not today." Peyton hesitated a moment longer, eyes darting between them. Then, with a curse, he mounted his horse. His wounded men followed. As they turned down the trail, Charlotte lowered her rifle, her breath coming fast and shallow. "I shot at him." She whispered, "I." Jed took the gun gently from her hands. "You protected what's yours. That's what you did." Her eyes filled with tears. "What's mine?" He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch rough but tender. "Me. This place. Your life. All of it." She gave a small, watery laugh. "I can't go back now, can I?" Jed shook his head. "Don't think you ever could." Quote, For a long moment, they stood there in the doorway, snow swirling around them, firelight spilling into the cold. Then she stepped closer, her forehead resting against his chest. "I'm tired of running," she said softly. "I just want to stay." He wrapped his arms around her, then stay. When she looked up, her green eyes shimmered in the firelight. "You once said you couldn't control yourself around me," she whispered. Jed smiled, a rare, unguarded smile that reached his eyes for the first time in 15 years. "I still can't," he said, "and I don't ever want to try." He kissed her then, slow, certain, full of everything they'd both been too afraid to feel. The storm had taken many things from them, but it had given them this, a second chance neither thought they'd ever get. That night, the mountains were quiet again. Inside the cabin, the fire burned warm and steady, and for the first time since Mary's grave, Jed Holt slept without ghosts.